Allora, cominciamo l'ultima sessione della nostra conferenza. Il primo intervento è di Natalia Romé, Theoretical Time, Political Time, Althusser between Machiavelli and Marx.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Quiero agradecer la invitación. Estoy muy contenta de estar aquí discutiendo estas cuestiones, a pesar de que en mi país la situación está un poco complicada. Hay una represión muy importante y es algo que, una preocupación que no puedo dejar de compartir con ustedes. Bueno, escuchando las intervenciones anteriores, ayer, de hoy, empecé a pensar una cuestión que quisiera compartir. Voy a hablar en castellano solamente esta parte, luego voy a leer en inglés. Pero me gustaría plantear la idea de que la temporalidad no existe, ni siquiera la temporalidad plural. En todo caso, lo que existe es un proceso complejo de unificación del tiempo, un proceso histórico concreto. En este sentido, expresiones como el, tiempo, la, temporalidad deben tomarse con cuidado, porque antes que categorías filosóficas, se presentan como nociones ideológicas que dan cuenta de un régimen hegemónico de experiencia de la temporalidad. El proceso de dominación persiste no solamente en la noción unificada del tiempo, en la idea de una historia universal, por ejemplo, que en tanto ideología puede incluso ser retomada con fines combativos o emancipatorios. Entiendo en esa clave algo de lo que planteaba Con Vasos hace un rato, sino antes bien en la unificación conceptual misma, es decir, en la idea de un tiempo en general, sea este único o múltiple. En este sentido, podemos convenir en llamar temporalidad plural a una hipótesis, pero no una hipótesis de lectura, quiero decir, o de crítica, pero no puede tratarse de un objeto teórico que reclamaría algo así como una ciencia del tiempo. Esto, desde luego, no invalida en absoluto la posibilidad de la reflexión filosófica en torno al problema de la temporalidad, pero sí la coloca en un lugar específico, en el lugar de una práctica teórica de combate por el tiempo, es decir, una práctica que no puede sino ejercerse como crítica de la unidad conceptual del tiempo en general. Esta práctica existe positivamente, de hecho, en múltiples análisis concretos de la historia, de la coyuntura, y en las formas de pensamiento estratégico orientado a la intervención. Mi preocupación es colocar la pregunta respecto del modo en que podemos plantear filosóficamente el problema del tiempo. Es decir, una pregunta acerca del estatuto teórico de esa preocupación y de sus posibilidades y límites. En este sentido, la intervención que voy a compartir encuentra en el proceso de pensamiento de Luis Althusser algunas pistas para pensar esta cuestión. Se trata de referencias heterogéneas, difíciles de asir y plenas de recursos extrateóricos, especialmente el uso de metáforas en lugar de categorías. Justamente ese es mi punto de partida y el horizonte del modo en que me interesa trabajar la cuestión del tiempo, como una exigencia de crítica de la propia conceptualidad, tomando a la práctica como criterio de lo verdadero. La idea que orienta mi trabajo es que la posibilidad de pensar críticamente el tiempo requiere de una crítica del concepto, y que esto supone la asunción de la condición práctica de la teoría, es decir, que una problematización teórica del tiempo en general avanza en la medida en que problematiza también sus propios procedimientos y el dispositivo teórico que resulta de ellos. Para decirlo de otro modo, una reflexión del tiempo supone una crítica de la ideología del presente, entendido como captura de la complejidad histórica por el concepto idealista de presente absoluto. So here I go in English. The title could be changed for this one. Can we read time? Theoretical dispositive and theatrical machinery. In what we could call the Althusserian problematic, the question of politics and the problem of political thought constitutes a paradoxical unit with the so-called theoreticist deviation. Under the heavy burden of that name, which after May 68 not merely alludes to a certain theoretical perspective, but involves a political accusation, is neglected the central question of the Althusserian critique of the theory, practice, dichotomy. In fact, Althusserian bed consists in the paradoxical movement of emplacing thought on the liminal space in which theory and politics become united and differentiated, making their disjoint unity the structure of his problematic. Whatever dialectical materialism is for Althusser, it will result of the two in which the theoretical questions overwhelmed by the political problematic, which involve subject and time. In this sense, the resource to dramaturgical metaphor offers the opportunity to explore the scope of materialist philosophy in relation with both categories. Althusser's invocation of the theatre pursues the deconstructive effect of making thinkable what the philosophical field tends to leave unthinkable. And it is in this sense that Althusser focuses, is this one? But Althusser focuses thank you, on the theatrical practice of Brecht, intended neither to eliminate the theatre nor to produce any anti-theatre, but to operate on its structure a similar displacement to the one Marx produced in philosophical pamphlets. Far from seeking the removal of the philosophical or theatrical representations, the materialism that Brecht and Marx operate is nothing but walking through the fields of theatre or philosophy, assuming that the present absence that behind them determine their form, as both of them, suggest Althusser, exist to suppress politics to which they owe their existence. With this framework, we may rediscover in Lire le Capital some elliptical evocation to Goethe's Faust and the broad sequence of philosophical and political evocation that it brings with it. In the last page of Le défaut de l'économie classique, esquisse du concept du temps historique, at Lire le Capital, Althusser ironically recalls the famous vindication of the greenness of life in opposition to the greyness of theory at Goethe's Faust. This elliptical reference reminds us, firstly, a large genealogy of philosophical readings, including Hegel, Marx, and Lenin, among much others, that interrogate the connection between theoretical and political thought. In this sense, it is inevitable to find there a critical dialogue with the preface of Philosophy of Right, where Hegel puts in a discussion with Goethe, referring to absolute knowledge, to assert the primacy of philosophy over religion and art. Well, here goes the celebrated phrase. When philosophy paints in grey, one form of life has become old, and by means of grey, it cannot be rejuvenated by only noon. The ode of Minerva takes it fly only. But for Althusser, the problem is not resolved with a simple rejection of Hegelian idealism. It requires instead action on two fronts: against the omnipotence of the concept or theory and the assertion of pure life or praxis, to demonstrate the deep connection between them. This is not by chance. Althusserian thought does not proceed through mere denial, but through taking the inherent aporia of a discourse to its extremes. Althusserian theoretical practice works on a philosophical discursive matter, producing the simultaneous critique of abstract oppositions. In this sense, he says, we are also aware of the fact that the concrete in life may be the pretext for facile chatter, which serves to mask either apologetic ends, such as a god, whatever his plumage, is always lining his nest with the feeders of the superabundance, transcendence of the concrete in life, or mere intellectual laziness. This fragment ironizes against the celebration of practice, understood as immediately grafted into the concrete life and as an affirmation of the percipio over the cogito. The phenomenological inversion leaves intact the essence of idealism, which is the religious complicity between logos and being. Althusser identifies it as the core procedure of idealistic epistemology, the myth of religious reading. intended as an immediate and transparent access through things. The back reference to Faust gives, nevertheless, a new light to this Althusserian critique of empiricism, insofar as the problem of practice exceeds the theoretical field, and therefore it warns against the risk of an idealistic conception of political practice, figured as the specular inversion of the concept. In this sense, the development of the Althusserian problematic through several decades can be conceived in terms of a persistent effort to dissolve every form of identification between the problem of knowledge and the question about politics, recalled in the different reappearance of the religious myth of the state of nature. Althusserian theory of reading requires recognizing that materialism is not another philosophy, but the assumption of the most radical effects of the conflictive inherence of philosophical field, which marks the surface of each philosophical theory with inner contradiction and ideological inconsistencies. And in this sense, the point is that this political approach to philosophy, which might be considered a typical late Althusserian thesis, but it can be deduced from the very structuralist philosophical movement, as Etienne Balibar points out. Here's a quotation of Balibar, who says, from structuralist point of view, the distinction between philosophy and non-philosophy has essentially relative signification. Structuralism presents itself in particular coherent and radical way as a practice of immanent externality. So here's a figure, a spatial figure of what Althusser might consider the practical critique, or the practice of critique, the immanent externality. Similarly, Althusser's intervention is about insisting on symptomatic exceptions spread on philosophical field to reveal what they are aimed to forbid, political practice as its immanent externality. Moreover, it is only by means of a serious consideration of political practice as a limit of theoretical field that we can understand the concept of theoretical practice itself. In this sense, the elliptical references to Goethe's Faust have a beautiful meaning. They reveal a disadjustment, but not any disadjustment. They exhibit the disadjustment of what it could be conceived as the greatest ideological operation of unification at a modern age, an operation that is encrypted as humanist epistemology and consolidates a strategic alliance between the two idealistic forms of theory and politics, one characterized by the illusion of cognitive immediacy, and the other by the divine image of free and creative action. Both of them imply the myth of the state of nature as the religious myth of reading. The state of nature is analyzed by Althusser at L'Initiation à la philosophie pour les non-philosophes, a text that has remained unpublished until recently. The myth of Eden is supported by the idea of fundamental identity between perception, intelligence, and language, a space in which the truth of things present, and the things themselves could be pulled out by a straight gaze. According to Althusser, Christian paradise is thus the typical image of empirism, where the abstract and the concrete match perfectly and without excess. It is the myth of completely satisfied human being, a place where no working is needed, neither for living nor for know. Therefore, Edenic relationships between men are as transparent as those that they build with nature. Conceived as an immediate union of body and soul, human being is guided, following the movement of nature. There is neither conflict nor crime in paradise, therefore there is no need for right or for politics. It's right there, at this point, where symptomatic reading discovers the outside of idealistic modern philosophies as echoes of the religious myth of the state of nature, in which the idealistic discourse invests a deep materialist truth. Althusser points out at the Edenic scene the recourse to prohibition as the symptom of divine omnipotence, where it finds, paradoxically, its own limits. Warren Montag has demonstrated how deeply Althusser seeks the hidden excess of theological siege to philosophy to discover a symptom of its forbidding surplus. As Montag points out, interventions were nothing less than acts of theological philosophical sabotage. Their strange and troubling formulas are the sabots thrown into the machine that produces the cover over the part of the present that we call the future, halting its operation and in doing so breaking the ties that bound us to destiny. In a paper entitled Althusser and the Problem of Eschatology, Montag identifies the religious genealogy of the famous phrase about the last instance. Ni au premier ni au dernier instant, l'heure solitaire de la dernière instance ne sonne jamais. This phrase is very close to the revelation or apocalypse phrase, where the uncovering or revealing of what had been hidden takes the form of a declaration by Jesus Christ. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first, Protos, and the last, Eschatos, the beginning, Arche, and thus origin, and the end, Telos. This shows how the symptomatic reading works in its reconstruction. Montag poses in this way that the core of Althusser's structuralism is a problem of time. So he points out that Althusser's economy is an absent cause, a cause nowhere present but in its effects. Before and after, first and last, beginning and end do not apply to the God who exists only in his degrees, who acts by not acting and who arrives by not arriving. It is the occasion of his non-arrival that must be marked and celebrated, the end that does not come. A long battle for the future is fought at the ground of philosophy. It is always a double conflict against theology and positivism. Assuming the emplacement of philosophy in history, Althusserian problematic stands for its right to exist. Therefore, it can't consist in suppressing completely the religious memory placed deeply at the history of philosophy. Materialism is a position, the result of an actual activity of identifying the forms of ideological unification in the historically configured philosophical field. This is the sense in which Althusser reads the religious genealogy of idealistic philosophies, whose discourses refer in a displaced form to the opacity of real existence. This is implied in their persistent effort to restore the imaginary immediacy of social relations. This reading allows us to understand why, when ascendant bourgeoisie needs to reach masses to constitute its own ideological unification, produces a mythical discourse that assumes a polemical form, a controversial texture, to the extent that it is compelled to take account of masses' existence, their practical experience and material conditions. Philosophical discourse is engraved with the mark of a siege. Every philosophical theory is beset by its opposite because it reproduces on its surface the conflict in which it is externally committed. This immanent personality reveals the enrollment of the philosophy in history. It is well worth remembering that while reading Capital, Althusser identifies the historicist misunderstanding, where many philosophical genealogies seem to be tied up, as the primordial strategic location. In relation with this, the Freudian category of overdetermination, with which Althusser reformulates dialectical materialism, works simultaneously in two fronts. It puts into a new field the question about theoretical apodicticity, and secondly, it matches the concept of a differential temporality that enables the political thought. In this sense, a materialist approach to the theory of history involves a problematization of classical epistemology, which governs the continuity of time by a wide variety of religious images of immediacy. Althusser understands that the materialist concept of history demands a confrontation with Hegelian notion of time, which is the reflection inexistence of the continuity of the dialectical development of the idea. The relation between the social totality and its historical existence is a relation with an immediate existence. Althusser identifies the central features of Hegelian temporality as homogeneous continuity of time and contemporaneity of time, involved in the category of historical present. This entails that the relational complexity of social practices is restricted to existence in a contemporary present. The status of the spiritual whole despises the effectiveness of the differences between the elements, and that's why the continuity of time expresses the presence of the concept in its positive determinations. In the last terms, ideology of the pure theory or the pure practice or of the pure frontier between them have in common this conception of contemporary and continuous time, which therefore supports the specular relation concerning the theory and the praxis. Within this framework, the scarce but powerful phrase of Faust spread among the pages of Marx's tradition to a spectrum of nuances faced by Althusser as the main enigma of heritage. Burden and opportunity, the richness of these literary evocations lay in their capacity to reveal the excessive element that besieges Marx's readings. Many of these readings of Faust concern Althusserian quotations, that ones of Hegel, Marx, Bloch, and Lukács. The phenomenological reading of the latter, for instance, finds and underlines in Faust a question about time related to politics. In his theory of novel, Lukács conceives it as the epic of a world abandoned by God. As Jameson shows, there is an ethical significance of novel in Lukács, where narration offers a sort of concrete ground for utopian activity. The Lucasian conversion to Marxism is read by Jameson as a passage from a metaphysical consideration of the relationship among the hero and his surrounding world to a conception of man and his relationship to society that, like nature, is created by man. But, as Brecht has shown, the problem of Lucasian consideration of action is the obliteration of the critical productive practices, mainly the procedures of the artist himself. In the question of theater, the limited condition of the piece is recalled in the Brechtian critique to Lukács' realism by underlying the significance of procedures. The serious consideration of practical procedures, the singular practices of staging a scene, is the kernel of an authentic materialism of art. The Althusserian theoretical dispositive meets the Brechtian in this deep consideration of the theoretical practice itself as the obliterated element of idealist philosophy of history. Phenomenological approaches illustrate the idealistic relationship between time and emanative causality in the Hegelian heritage as a relationship that works at the depoliticizing theory and that therefore closures the possibility of thinking its own limits. Temporality as an absolute and homogeneous presence is, according to Althusser, the principle behind the Hegelian formula, according to which no individual can jump over his time. The ontological category of present prohibits any thinking that brings us to the future, says Althusser. This thinking of this kind of thought cannot be a pure theoretical one, but it could be conceived in the conjunction between theoretical practice and non-theoretical ones. The opportunity of putting into shape this question depends on the opportunity of the combination of the theory with that which is not identical or immediate to it. If there is no anti-intellectual position in Althusser, it's because he is concerned in searching a kind of theoretical apodoicity capable of making room for political chance, or, in temporal terms, a critical reading of the present that, by posing the question of reproduction as duration, can open an interrogation about politics as a thinking tend to the future. This sort of necessity of contingency is found by Althusser in the idea of overdetermined dialectics. I would say that Althusser's operation here is not about rejecting Hegelian dialectics, but to pose an internal distance with it by reading the foreclosure of political temporality subsumed by philosophical temporality of absolute present. At the preface of Philosophy of Right, Hegel states the task of philosophy, the apprehension of what is, because what is reason. Philosophy becomes, from then on, an inquisition into the rational, and therefore the apprehension of the real and present. In this sense, he submits that every individual is a son of its time, while philosophy is its time apprehended in concepts. Hence, it would be so foolish to believe that philosophy can transcend its present world as to believe that an individual could leap out of his time or jump over roads. To recognize reasons as the roads in the grasp of the present is to conceive clearly the unity of form and content. As Althusser has pointed out, this conception of present constitutes the absolute horizon of all knowing, since it can only be anything but the existence in knowing of the internal principle of the whole. Tomorrow is in essence forbidden for idealistic thought. Althusser's reading takes us to Marx's own reading of Hegel in the well-known passage of 18 Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, where a sort of complex temporality arises. It has been said these days. I read just a piece. The social revolution of 19th century cannot draw its poetry from the past, it can only draw it from the future. The revolution of 19th century must lead to death, bury their dead, in order to arrive at its own issues, at its own issue. With the former, the phrase surpasses the substance. With this one, the substance surpasses the phrase. The core question arises among Hegelian notion of time as an absolute present, and that one which Althusser reads in Marx. It is within the spectrum opened by this difference of temporalities where the question of politics starts to take shape. The ontological category of Hegelian present prevents any anticipation of thought, any knowing that deals with the future. At this point, we understand why Althusser affirms that no Hegelian politics is possible, and that in fact there has never been a Hegelian politician. This quotation of Lire le Capital about the lackness of Hegelian politician alludes to the problem of political thought placed at the liminal space of theory. Is this liminal space what cannot be considered by a philosophy of the adjustment between substance and phrase? Moreover, we are led to think that this kind of philosophy finds its own task on the effort of resisting any décalage between substance and phrase. This will be the great challenge for materialist philosophical position, to give rise to a problematization of time from the very deconstruction of continuous contemporary time. In this way, the first step is to liberate political practice from the epistemological subordination of theoretical practice. The future of dialectical materialism depends on it. Althusser repeats it frequently, but this means that it should be conceivable a sort of philosophical necessity capable of opening its own inner space to such a knowing of the future. As we just said, that kind of knowing claims for a political thinking, not a theory about politics, but a political reading of an actual conjuncture insert in the very core of historical necessity. In Althusser's own terms, the analysis of the structure of a conjunction, the displacements and condensations of its contradictions and their paradoxical unity, all of which are the very existence of that current situation which political action was to transform in the strongest sense of the word between February and October 17. against the speculative thesis that conceives the concrete and the singular situation as the phenomena in which an a prioristic necessity expresses itself, the political thought manages to consider the contradictory unity of an actual conjecture. Far from idealistic theories, this singular kind of knowing is a knowing of the singular, a knowing of revolutionary practice placed within the liminal space of theoretical field. Materialist theory of history claims a reflective interrogation about the very theoretical practices and about the kind of theoretical dispositive. There is another moment in Althusser's writings where we can read the question of disjoint unity of politics and theory, posed as a question of procedures and montage. In his reading of Machiavelli, Althusser suggests that the problem of time opened by Machiavelli's political thinking is allowed by a singular topology, which he calls the theoretical dispositive of a manifesto. Theory, conceived as a disposition of elements, works as a sort of theatrical machinery that makes possible a battle against the philosophical dichotomy of genesis and structure, while it turns thinkable the complexity of time as a sort of structured time of times. Like in Marx, Machiavellian conjunction between theoretical concept and political thinking convokes the critique of the phenomenological experience of absolute present. This can be read in the figure of the bowman evoked by Machiavelli to pose the problem of the political challenge of facing the limits of the conjunction. The bowman, Machiavelli says, puts his eyesight, Machiavelli, read by Althusser, puts in his eyesight beyond his target to reach it, the foundation of a new state. Political intelligence of the situation requires to aim very high beyond what exists, but this means two things, as Althusser emphasizes. To aim very high means to consider the great cases of history. It is the time for theoretical thinking, the thinking of the fait accompli. To look forward means here to look backward. At the same time, to aim very high receives another meaning, not an explicit one, but a practical one. It supposes to go beyond what exists, to reach a blank that does not exist, but it should. It is the question of the void within the present, but this is not theorized by Machiavelli. It is exposed in a topological way, the topology of his theoretical discourse, a manifesto discourse. Yes, I'm already finishing. The theoretical dispositive of the manifesto, characterized by its specific disposition, which offers a singular representation of the unpresentable, a material configuration of theoretical elements that figure the liminal space where political action is present by absence. The void evoked by Machiavelli with the indetermination of the name of the prince works in a double sense. First, as a kind of immanent externality placed in the core of theory, a lack of knowledge that works at the center of knowledge. Secondly, an absence of meaning placed as a kernel of political interpellation, a void instead of an ideal that could restore a scheme of imaginary identification. This topology evokes and simultaneously confronts the phenomenological scheme of the subject's drama performed in a concentric topology where time is reduced to the imaginary lifetime of the individual or collective hero. It was Michel Bechet who underlined the fecundity of the notion of interpellation as the theatrical metaphor of the conscience-centered topology. In Althusserian notion of interpellation, Bechet underlines conscience is exposed as a theatrical montage, an unequal and combined disposition of elements, the characters, the narration, the special effects, the architecture of the theater itself, etc., where cognitive functions depends to an eccentric determinations from the unconscious and the non-cognitive forces. The notion of void does not record a philosophical conception of pure void, but refers to a specific position in a topological configuration. A temporal decalage that works within readings and between them as the presentation of immanent externality. The special image performed by Balibar, but anticipated by Derrida and Lacan, among others, poses the link between the overdetermined conjunction of heterogeneous practices, mainly theoretical practice and political practice, and the temporal complexity. This complexity exceeds the figure of the bowman that confronts the Hegelian man that won't ever jump over his time. It also connects with the Brechtian question about the procedures and montage, in the sense of a problem of the actual political effects of the concrete theoretical discourse. The question about the ways in which determinate thinking opens its internal space for the thinking of the future, which is not the future represented in the interior of the scene, but practiced beyond the theater itself. Machiavelli's theoretical dispositive manages to configure in a topology the unpresentable question of the link between determination and comments, form and exception, in other words, the connection between conjoncture and conjonction, that works as the key of material dialectics, the overdetermined dialectics. Althusser points out that Machiavelli holds up the two ends of the chain. He thinks and raises this theoretical distance, this kind of contradiction, without pretending, without proposing it, in the form of a notion or a solution. Machiavelli thinks politically his problem as a contradiction in reality, which cannot be solved in thought, but in reality. In Poor Marx, 10 years before, the image of the suspensory chain had been used by Althusser to evoke the specific of dialectical materialism. Marx has at least given us the two ends of the chain and has told us to find out what goes on between them. On the other hand, determination in the last instance by the economic mode of production, on the other, the relative autonomy of the superstructures and the specific effectivity. This clearly breaks with the Hegelian principle of explanation by consciousness of self-ideology, but also the Hegelian theme of phenomenon, essence, truth of. Of course, the metaphor of the suspended change matches the Leninist image of the weakest link. As Althusser underlines in Poor Marx, Lenin gave this metaphor above all practical meaning. A change is as strong as its weakest link. In general, anyone who wants to control a given situation will look for a weak point in case it should render the whole system vulnerable. On the other hand, anyone who wants to attack it, even if the odds are apparently against him, need only discover this own weakness to make all its power precarious. So far, there is no revelation here for readers of Machiavelli, expert in the arts of defense, as the destruction of opposition, and judge all armor by its faults. To conclude, the simultaneous battle against both the emperorist and idealist forms of continuous and contemporary time is, at last, a conflict within the religious images of Genesis, the idealistic between logical order and historical order, which remind us the Edenic nostalgia of immediacy of life. Althusser led us to understand that it will be only by questioning these ideologies of time interwoven into epistemology that it will be possible a political thought, and thus to consider political practice as a real practice. It is only after having settled this confusion that the distance to think political as a practice of this word can be opened and rooted out of the domain of the small god of the word, image of the great God. Althusserian theoreticism can be considered hence as an immense theoretical effort to pursue the implication of the aporia called theoretical practice to its limits, that is, towards that impossible place of the current instinct. There lays the great challenge of materialist position, the radical adventure of thinking politics. Thank you.